All right. So my name is Amit Chaurasia. I will be the instructor for this session on information visualization. And this session is a series of lectures which are pulled out for my master's course on data visualization. So we will talk about various concepts, the background about visualization, and then, feel free to ask me any questions you have along the way. And I posted the slides and some notes, links to those in the breakout room Slack channel. So feel free to download those if you like. There is also a link to resources page from my course web page. So feel free to look at that and, feel free to bookmark it if you want to revisit it later. It lists a lot of visualization tools, papers, or some key papers, and some other things that you may find useful. Okay, so let's get started. And I'll have to turn off my video because my computer does not like screen sharing and the video at the same time. So let's see. Okay. All right. Can you folks see my screen for the presentation? Okay, great. So let's start with introductory motivation for data visualization, and then we go on and build upon various concepts. So when we talk about visualization, well, the immediate question is, why should one care about visualization, right? And so let's do a couple of quick exercises to kind of see some how we can answer that kind of question in a exemplary manner. So if we look at the slide, it shows a few hundred digits of pi. And if somebody were to ask a question and say, how many threes are there in this series of numbers? Well, how will we go about answering this sort of a question? Well, one idea would be to, let's write a script which parses all the numbers and calculates, sums them up, and then spits out an answer. And, that's perfectly fine way of doing that sort of thing. However, if we were to twist the question or change the question to ask something different, that, how many threes occur in each line, or is there a pattern in the number of threes that happen or occur? How will we go about answering that question? And now we need to go back and modify our script or come up with a new way of writing that algorithm to find those pieces. And that can become pretty taxing if we keep changing the question to find something different around it. And if we change the question yet again and say, tell me where the threes are happening and the context around it. I want to find why 3 is happening and what's in the neighborhood of 3. Well, now that's not really an easy question to kind of code up and develop an algorithm and write something about. And so we can look at another way of kind of answering some of these questions indirectly or directly even, is by using a visual representation. In this case, we are just highlighting the threes, and we can see where they are happening. We can obviously tally them and show them like so as well. But the idea is that once you kind of transform the data into an abstract visual representation, it starts to give us some context around the data as well. And that is very powerful, and that can help us answer some additional questions or help us ask more questions about what we are trying to analyze. And this happens a lot in research. You start out with a problem and a question, but it's never really one question. It's the questions keep changing, the questions keep evolving, and and that's the process, but coming up with ways to kind of analyze the data, you need different kind of tools to answer those sort of questions, and visualization is one of those tools. Okay, so let's take a look at another kind of interesting demonstration, if you will. So if you look at the screen, there are, set of squares here. And so observe closely and see what happens. I'm going to walk through the slides here. So what did you observe? So if you want to ask this question and say each of you observed something, and you can pretty much say what you observed fairly easily. But if I were to ask a question that, how many squares were there, most of us wouldn't get the number right. And it doesn't really matter, because what matters is the change. So let's go back and look at what happened. So we see a shape changed. We see the texture changed for one of the squares. We see the size changed. We see the hue change, or the saturation change, I should say. And the orientation changed here. And here the brightness changed. And here the position changed. And now we have the hue change, or the color change. So we can observe these changes very, very quickly. And this is something which is called pre-attentive processing in cognition. And this is something which we can't do anything about it. We just observe it. This is built into our visual system, that we will gather this information unconsciously. And we don't really have to do anything about it. We just observe it. And so these attributes are some of the pre-attentive attributes. There are many more in addition to that, but some of these are heavily used in visualization to construct that visual representation for the data. So let's define visualization. Each of us will have a different definition of visualization. For this tutorial, we need to have a more precise or a concise definition of what we are talking about. So in this case, I'd like to define visualization as encoding or mapping of data into a visual representation that is reproducible or reusable, that the purpose for which is to gain insight or extract or share knowledge, right? And so there are a bunch of words there, but there are a couple of words that are highlighted or shown in the bold text. There are two keywords. One is data. So if you do not have data, you don't really have visualization. You can have illustration, or you can have some other things, but you don't really have visualization. The other two words are reproducible and reusable, which means that there is a method to generate those things. In other words, there is an algorithm which is generating these visualizations. So if you provide the same data again, it should produce the same result. Or if you provide a similar data set, it's not necessarily the same, it should give us similar or reusable result, right? So visualization is about algorithms, and it is about data. Contrary to a lot of people who think about visualization as only about art or something like that, it's not, right? It's about methods to produce something which is reproducible and reusable. And these lectures are based on a textbook called Visual Analysis and Design. I don't think if I have a reference to that yet, but I'll post that in Slack. And that book defines it slightly differently, and it defines it on a purpose. So visualization is meant for people, right? If there are no people, the visualization doesn't make any sense. And so people and visualization go together. And so why would we want to do visualization? Well, the idea is, can we create very, very concise representation of an underlying data? Can we create a representation that unambiguously allows us to see that data is it intuitive enough, the picture that we create? And can we interact with the picture that is created? And can it scale? So if your data changes or the data is large, can we keep applying those sort of techniques to accomplish those things? However, in reality, all these things cannot be done simultaneously. One word about intuitiveness. Many times we talk about creating pictures and say that people will understand it. That's not necessarily the case. The intuitiveness here is about trainability. And one example for that is if you have ever seen an X-ray image of something, of a body part, and if we were to pose a question and ask, can you find what is the problem? And most of the times you won't be able to tell where there may be an issue. However, if we ask physician the same question and say that what is a problem in this with this image of an X-ray image, they'd be able to tell us. And once they point to us where the problem is, we can also learn where the issue is and what should have been the case and what's not the case. And with repeated exposure to those sort of images, we can train ourselves and then develop this intuitiveness about it. And the good thing here is that when we work on research or a problem of some sort, we are looking and working with same type of data over and over again. So we may not have intuitiveness to begin with when we start working with the data or start to look at the visualization or the images of that data right away. But over time, we gain familiarity and we develop an intuitive sense of what to look for. Most often you would be kind of ignoring certain pieces of data which you think is inconsequential or not really very interesting, but you'll be looking for some artifacts that are interesting or anomalous, and you want to figure those out. And so you build this intuitiveness through some sort of training, right? So you need some exposure to those sort of things over time. You will gain that. I think this is probably more relevant now than it was probably 10 years ago. The question is that why do we want to have some human in the loop, right? Why can't we automate all these things? Well, the problem is somebody has to create that automated solution, right? So if you already have an automated solution, you don't really need visualization. But when you don't, well, you need someone to create it, and then someone to validate that whatever that solution is going to do is going to be right. More often than not, visualization is heavily used for problems where the problems are not well defined. So how can you automate something for which you haven't really defined the problem in good enough detail in a concrete way? And that's kind of the thing which we looked at earlier when I was talking about digits of pi. The problems are not very well defined. They keep changing. And so we don't really have a well-set method to go and solve those things. And then, of course, there's the utility aspect of the visualization, which is to share the results with others, communicate with others. But then there are other things also which are not heavily used, but are important use cases for visualization, which is to confirm an hypothesis or to do inspection and exploration. And this is not necessarily meant for public use, but this is meant for just identifying and studying a problem and figuring out what may be going on. And so this is heavily used, of course, by the users to kind of figure out what may be going on with the data, to refine something or to debug something if you're working with a modeling and simulation environment. Also, the question is that why use visual encoding? And here is a set of graphs, which is based on biological data on some genes getting activated and others not, based on some drugs that have been given to them. And the idea is if we were to kind of ask that, okay, let's try to remember these things somehow. Well, there's a lot of information to remember, and we don't really have a large short-term working memory to kind of store all this information for for simultaneously and be able to kind of pull out the details as needed. And so creating external representation augments our capability to analyze lots of information in much more easier form. And so visualization is not the only thing that we do with external representation. If you think about books and written word, it's exactly that. We are offloading all that information into external medium so we can get back to it later. And by the virtue of it being external, we can also share it with others. And so others can also benefit from that. So the question then is that if you can create external representation, why rely on vision? We have other senses as well. Why not use those? One good property about vision is that our visual cognition or visual information processing is incredibly parallel and pre-attentive, like we saw earlier. We can capture such a high fidelity information in such a short period of time that is just simply incredible. And so we have a tremendously high bandwidth to the brain through a visual channel. But if you look at sound, touch, and taste, or other senses, we really don't have that sort of thing going on. And so those mechanisms are not really suitable to encode data and rely on them in a tangible way. So if you look into sound, we don't really have a great way of kind of absorbing a lot of sound information. It's also sequential. Same thing with touch and smell. With touch, smell, and taste, we don't even have viable devices either. So vision it is. And the idea is, again, reproducibility, right? And we were talking about this earlier in the definition, that visualization obviously started out before computers in form of illustration, where people tried to kind of sketch out things and phenomena and develop an idea about what they are trying to represent. Maps are also an example of that. But the idea of replication and interactivity is simply not possible with hand-drawn illustrations and figures. And so computing is integral part of this sort of thing. And it exploits the things that people have done in the past to use those techniques and codify those techniques and bring them up in a reusable and interactive manner. So again, here are a couple of graphs which you can interact with. On the right side, you see this busy graph and you see these highlighted red lines. All it is doing is you picked a node, the user picked a node somewhere in the middle, and it's highlighting all the connections in that graph, right? So that notion of interactivity is also very powerful. So here is another example of looking at data and identifying its structure. So here we have four series of data sets as an XY pair shown on the bottom right of the screen. And if we look at the statistics for all these four data sets, they happen to be identical. So the X, Y, mean and variance is the same. Correlation is the same, and what's not visible, even the regression line is just the same. And if you were to ask, have a hypothesis about this data, and if you were to ask a question that what do you think make of these statistics, and one of the answer or one of the objective answers for this sort of thing is that maybe the data sets are mostly similar. But if we plot them and look at them visually, we can see that these four data sets are actually quite dissimilar. And this was a contrived data set published by Enscombe almost like 4 decades back. And his insight was that don't just rely on statistics. You have to have another way of verifying your hypothesis and validating what you're seeing as statistic to actually infer the meaning behind them. And so if you look at it this way, that, visualization complements other tools in helping you to provide that additional validation of your data through an independent method, right? So if you think about machine learning or statistics and visualization, they form a triad, or maybe even analytic methods. You can use one or the other to kind of validate the answers coming out from the other methods. And that way you can confirm your hypothesis or disprove it. Interactivity. Again, it's a very, very powerful method in kind of providing us information in a compelling way, provided it's constructed well. And we use this very often. Maps are a great example of interactivity. If you look at the top left inset over there, it shows the map of the United States, where we can see, the 48 states marked up in text. But as you start to zoom in, and now we are in the right top image, we see that we have zoomed in the western part of US, and now we can see actually the freeways or the interstate highways are becoming visible. Then we go further along and zoom into the Southern California region. And now we can see even smaller cities are appearing. And then finally, when we have zoomed into UCSD, we can see the internal roads also kind of visible, and other information is appearing. And this is a very powerful concept, although it's a little tricky to kind of implement and make it available. But if you see that, there are two things happening simultaneously. There is a geometric zoom that is happening. That means we have blown up the scale of something, and we are looking at it at a shape, at a much more closer range. But then there is the information has changed between the different zoom levels. So every time you zoom in, a different contextual layer of information is made available. And this is very powerful. And the idea is that you can, this sort of metaphor of providing an overview first and then providing details on the map is possible through interactivity. So there is a semantic zoom, which is bringing in the information as we kind of zoom in, and there's a geometric zooming also happening because we are, scaling up something. And so we can also filter and customize lots of things. And we'll talk about this EDM design space quite a bit. What that means is that, we found that there were like 8 or 9 visual encoding or pre-attentive channels, properties or attributes we found earlier. If we were to kind of start to look at that, how many ways can we combine those 8 encodings to the data attributes? Well, we have a very large amount of space to kind of work with. And if we try to find all the combination and try to brute force it, that doesn't quite work. And so we need to carefully look at the available ingredients for visualization, if you will, and marry them with the kind of tasks that we want to accomplish. And that is the idea of creating these representations that actually cater to a solution that we are trying to be after. So it's not visualization. Oftentimes people will think about very I'm trying to say a word which makes sense here. Very much like an artifact way, like let's do an XY plot. Sometimes it makes sense, but does the XY plot solves the problem that you are trying to address? And so the idea is to step back and look at the problem and then come up with a visual representation. Maybe XY plot is the answer, maybe it's not. And so why would we create an XY plot? And so we need to have a better method of kind of objectifying how would we choose the right kind of design to answer a certain set of tasks and questions. And so that's what we will kind of explore a little bit more as we go along further. And so there are different visual idioms or techniques that are available. Actually, there are two fields that evolve in parallel, independent of each other. And there are parallels, and they don't really exist in isolation of each other, but they evolve separately, and that's how we structure these material as well. So there is an aspect which we call scientific visualization, which deals with sort of physical data, generally coming from medical data, like CT scans, MRI scans, or simulations like flow simulations from turbulence, climate simulations and things like that. They sort of have a physical property of some sort. On the other hand, we have information visualization, which deals with abstract information like tables, employee information records, or other information which don't necessarily have a physical sense, but they do have its data nonetheless, and the techniques are different. So in this case, in this session, we'll be talking a little bit more about the information visualization concepts. We covered the scientific visualization concept in the session yesterday. And if you missed that, I think you can look at the recording at a later time. Okay, so the idea is to look at task and effectiveness. And the task is, what are you trying to answer? What is the purpose of visualization? And if you know the purpose of visualization, then all the idioms that are available to us, different kind of charts and plots, they are not really suitable equally to serve that task. So we need to know what that task is, and we need to know what would be effective design for that sort of a task. In identifying effectiveness is not an easy thing to do, because once you create a visualization, you have to do an analysis with the users to figure out whether that makes sense or is it useful or not. So just creating an illustration or a method which represents the data is not sufficient. And so we need to really kind of look at tools that will help us to kind of create these representations which are effective. And whether we do that user study or not, that's kind of dependent on the resources available and the time available. But at least we want to get to a solution which is built on reason, and not just on we happen to put together something and we may or may not find something useful here. So and then we also need to know, why would something be effective? And we can answer those questions in different ways. We can say that something is effective if it allows us to do new kind of analysis, or speed up some sort of workflow which we have. So we know that we are kind of homing on into the right sort of solution which is useful and effective. However, visualization has its own set of problems to deal with. And this is not necessarily just limited, the computation issue is not just limited to visualization. We come across this limitation everywhere. How fast can you process the data? How much memory is available? If the data is sitting on a network or a disk, which needs to pass through a network, then we need to deal with those bottlenecks also. With visualization, we also have constraints with the display, that how will we display the final image? What is the resolution of the device? What is the color property of that device? And how much information can we cram onto that display? And lastly, we have the limitation or the constraints that come from a human point of view, that humans just simply don't have an ability to pay attention to something for a long period of time. We also have an issue about how much we can remember, and we also have some issues with colors. Not everyone can see all the colors very well. So we have to deal with all these things and do some trade-offs. And then, there are other things which kind of come along as well, that when you create a representation of sort, you are going to inherently have some lossiness in that process when you abstract away something. You have to figure out what the domain knowledge is, and you have to deal with, other issues like color blindness and, bias as well. So let's take a quick example of some of visualization for inspection and exploration. So this is going to be a little bit of repeat for folks who attended yesterday's session, but this is just short. So here is an example. Let me play a video. So here is an example of our earthquake simulation. This is 2D data, and it's showing ground movement along this in this area. And so the simulation starts somewhere in the middle and moves towards the right side. And you see the ground waves kind of moving through towards the right side mostly. But something happens halfway through in the simulation, and the top part of the boundary starts to reflect these waves. And if you look at the colors of these waves, it is very similar to the real thing that the simulation is trying to do. And so there's a bug in the simulation that all these boundaries are supposed to be absorbing the energy, but halfway through the simulation, the top boundary starts to reflect the waves back into the domain. And that's not really a good thing for the output of the simulation, because it's actually now changing the phenomena that the simulation was intending to model. And this sort of thing is very hard to catch numerically, because the numbers or the range of the data is very similar to the thing which we expect to see. But here is nothing but a simple color map or a heat map of the ground motion. But we can see that this is an artifact that shouldn't be there. And again, this sort of thing is probably most of the folks have never seen an earthquake simulation, but you saw it now. And once you see it, you expect to see some sort of these wave patterns, which we see. But now we also see that boundary reflection. Once it has been pointed out to you, you can start to build a sort of intuitive notion on what you expect to see in a simulation that is doing something which is expected versus something which is creating an artifact or something like that. So it's very useful to kind of look at the data in a visual form and analyze and see if that visually looks correct, and if there are any artifacts that can be spotted. Here is another example. Many times you have to kind of break up your data into different pieces for processing. And if possible, sometimes you can create a composite of that domain decomposition or the data decomposition and put it together to see whether the decomposition is right. There are many times there are problems with the boundaries that the data may not get created or divided up correctly, and the boundaries can create problems with modeling and simulation. Sometimes you're working with some sort of a mesh or this thing which is created with the pieces of triangles of tetrahedra. The triangles may not match up correctly with where they are kind of transitioning from very unstructured kind of region to more structured region, and there can be problems there. And you can visually inspect to see whether those there are any tears in the mesh or something like that. On the bottom left side, there is an image of a cube which is showing this red, blue, and white pattern. This is actually the data, volumetric data from the same earthquake simulation which you saw. And here what happened is that the simulation writes the data in one form, and the analysis needs to use the data in another form. And when the data was being translated, there was a bug in the code which changed the XY loop as XZY, and the data got kind of wrapped around in the entire cube. Instead of showing that nice wave pattern that we saw, it is actually wrapped around into the entire cube. And so these kind of things happen quite often, actually, and sometimes they can be missed, and they can lead to incorrect analysis down the road. And kind of having a validation for the data translation is very useful. And in this case, the visualization helps you do that validation very, very quickly without writing special tools for doing that sort of validation. Here is another example. Here is a simulation which used to run on CPU, shown in the first column on the left side, and then the rows show the ground motion along X, Y, and Z, and they're all red, white, and blue kind of thing. Red is moving in one direction, blue is moving in the other direction, and the white area is the ground not moving much. And so this simulation got ported from CPU architecture to GPUs, and it looked like that the porting was just about right. But then if you look at the error here at this snapshot, you see that the XVX looks fine for the most part. There's some error, but not a whole lot. But if you look at VY, you see this big green spot in the GPU panel, which is really not there on the CPU panel. And so the simulation on the GPU is creating certain artifacts which you don't really see on the CPU simulation. And that causes a large source of error. So once this sort of visualization was created and passed back to the scientists, computational scientists, and geoscientists, they said that the porting doesn't look right. You need to look at figuring out why these artifacts are there and why the results differ between the two simulations. And they ended up finding, two kernels running in 32 bits instead of 64 bits, and one division by zero error. And once that simulation or those bugs were fixed, another set of runs were done and analyzed. And if you look at the right side, the right panel, you see that that's a revised GPU simulation now. And now if we compare that between the two, we see that there is very, very few differences. And you see some of these speckled portions here because that has to do with the CPU and GPU architecture computing double precession of floating point at a different scale. And so some of that is expected because they are not really the same architecture. Okay, I'm going to skip this one and this one and this one. And actually, let's talk about this one. Visualization can also be used to kind of study physical phenomena sometimes that happens. And so I think this is some sort of a fighter plane, and it's actually crossing the sound barrier. And so it is going Mach 1 or just beyond Mach 1. And what you see here is this kind of white steam kind of thing. It's actually a Mach cone. And that happens, that's the sonic boom which the projectile or a plane experiences when they cross the sound barrier. Turns out this sort of a Mach cone or a sonic boom is also possible in an earthquake. And so when the speed of movement in the ground passes the speed of sound in the ground, there is an equivalent of a seismic boom called a seismic cone. And you can see that amplification as well. So here is a visualization for that. So this is simulating a really large earthquake. And then here you see this kind of a wave actually traveling at a faster than speed of sound. And you see that artifact, that boom which appears is represented as a seismic boom. Yeah, you see that boom which comes up and the try to pause. Yeah, you see that peak. And by the way, this is all this is a abstract creation. The ground doesn't really move like this in an earthquake. This is just the velocity which is just being represented as color, but then the surface is being distorted to kind of represent that magnitude. So this is not the way the earthquakes actually manifest. This is just a visual representation to kind of show what may be going on. So the ground doesn't move like that. So those kind of that cone over here that we see is an equivalent of a Mach cone. So you can observe some of these patterns with a visual data representation sometimes. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm going to put the link to website, but there are some other readings as well. Feel free to kind of, grab these books and articles and take a look at that whenever you have a chance. But I'm going to put the link to the book for visual analysis and design in the Slack channel. All right, does the screen look okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's move on to the next section. And that is about abstraction. So here, we are going to break down the visualization into 3 pieces and talk about what is it that we are looking at, which is about the data abstraction. Why is about why are we looking at something, which is about task abstraction, which is why we are talking about something, why we are representing something in a visual form. And how is the notion of how are we going to represent that data into a visual form, or how will we encode the data into a visual form. So the first part, when we look at what, we have different type of data, and then we have different type of data set types, and we have different type of attributes. So let's look at that. When we look at type of data, we can have lots of things structured in some form, either as items or attributes or positions and grids. If we look at data types, they have different properties, which we can kind of think of as, categorized into different forms. You can have items, that means maybe a row in a table. It can have attributes, which could be something that is observed or recorded. Think of them as columns, maybe, if you're looking at tabular data. You can have a data type of link, which basically depicts some sort of relationship. Let's say there is a network, maybe the connection between the 2 nodes is a link. Then there can be a position. Let's say you're working with 2-dimensional grid. Each point is located somewhere in space. Or if you're working with a map, there is a latitude and longitude. So that's a position. And then there can be grids. And so grids is a construct for sampling continuous data. So let's say if you want to measure the temperature of the room we are sitting in, well, we can divide up the room into different, as a rectilinear space, and we can sample the temperature at each point, discretize that space, and represent that as a grid. It doesn't have to be rectilinear grid; it could be anything else, but whatever that structure is the grid that we are going to sample the continuous data on. A data set, in this case, is a collection of data types. And so if you're gonna look in this definition, then we have different type of data sets. Table is one type of data set where the items are rows. Network is another type of data set where you have node and links as the attributes. Field data could be another type where something is being sampled along a grid. So here we are seeing a curvilinear grid where we are sampling the data. Then we have geometric data, which is concerns itself with some sort of a fixed shape. So if you're looking at a map, we have spatial data going on. And then if we are looking at, for tables also, there can be multidimensional tables. And for networks, there could be trees, which is a special case of networks where, you have a root and a child and grandchild and so forth. The networks can loop back and forth together, right? So networks don't have a root, if you will, right? But trees do. So again, we can have different type of data set that can include different items. We already looked at tables can have items and attributes. Networks can have both links, items, and attributes. Attributes essentially are things that you are measuring. In case of tables, it could be different columns with price, name, something like that. In case of networks, it could be things that are measured around the nodes, whom you are friends with, where they live could be an attribute, and so forth. Fields, again, like I was talking about, temperature would be one thing that we can sample. That would be one attribute, but we can also sample pressure, or the wind, and that could be another attribute. In case of geometry, we have positions of the location of the shape as a positional item, but then we can have the city names and things like that as items, and then we can have cluster sets and lists, which is just a form of a set of items. Now the data set can be static, that means it's available as a file, but it can be dynamic too, right? So you have a streaming notion of data coming in. Let's say there is a device that measures the wind velocity at every instance, and that's streaming the data dynamically. You can have dynamic things coming on from places like Twitter as well, which continuously provide a stream of information coming through. If we look at attribute types, we can split them into two parts again. There can be categorical attributes, for example, shapes, and there can be ordered attributes. Now, the ordered attributes can again be subdivided into two different subcategories. One is ordinal. So here we have small, medium, and large. So there is an order associated with that attribute, but then it can also be quantitative, right? So we have a mass of something or weight of something, and that's explicitly noted as a quantitative measure. And the ordering direction can also be in few categories that either it can be sequential or diverging or cyclic, right? And those are the things that we can say decisively. But there can be it may not necessarily be ordered, but if those patterns are there, we can exploit them. So here is a spreadsheet which actually marks the columns as with their attributes, which category they belong in. So we have date, which is an ordered attribute, and it's quantitative in nature. Then we have order priority, which is kind of goes from 1 to 5. 5 is the lowest priority, 1 is the highest priority. Containers, which are small, medium, and large. And then we have an order ID, which is interesting, right? So order ID looks like it's quantitative, but it's really not. So order ID is nothing but a key for the order. If we replace those numbers with some arbitrary random characters, it'll still be fine. All we need is an identifier for an order, but not necessarily a number is fine, but it could be anything. So in this case, even though they are numbers, they are categorical. And one nice trick to kind of distinguish between categorical and quantitative, or even ordered, or not ordered, but quantitative attribute is you can't really do a math operation on a categorical. It doesn't make sense to subtract one order from the other, right? But date you can subtract. You can subtract, the product margin, but you cannot subtract a categorical value, even though it may be represented by number. So that's a nice trick to kind of remember how to distinguish between variable types, the attribute types. And this is sort of important because once you can kind of break down your data into different attributes and sub-attributes, later on we will see how we can exploit this knowledge in mapping them into the visual space. So it's essential to kind of know how to break down our data into different categories, whether it's a categorical attribute, whether it's an ordinal attributes, or whether it's a quantitative attributes. So we looked at the what type and their attributes. It's about data and their attributes. Now let's take a look at why. Why is the visualization tool being used? Well, the idea is obviously to accomplish something, some set of tasks. Now, what are tasks themselves? then we can define a nice vocabulary on what visualization, at a high level tries to accomplish. You can think of task as an action and a target pair. And these are actually cover quite a range of things. So maybe we are interested in discovering sort of a distribution, or we are interested in comparing a trend. We are interested in locating an outlier, or we are interested in browsing a topology of something. So there is an action and then there is a target. And that kind of provides us a good intuition of what, or a good way to kind of think about which design we may want to consider for our data. There can be other actions also associated with visualization task, which is, what is the purpose? The purpose is sometimes to consume the visualization, which means, either you're trying to explore something in form of a discovery, or you're trying to explain something when you're presenting something. It can also be casual, that, the visualization is just meant for entertainment purposes. And I don't know if this link will work or not, but I can show that if it works. And then there is another notion of produce, where you're trying to produce a derived set of things by performing a visualization. Either you're trying to annotate something or record something or create new derivatives from the data by some form of transformation. Maybe you want to create, contours on a map. That's a derived attribute. Maybe you want to create isosurfaces if it's in 3 dimension or something like that. So let's see if this works. Oh, they changed it. This doesn't have the visualization anymore. Let's see, John, if they plot this anymore. No, they don't plot it. Earlier, they used to plot it, and it would show the popularity of names. So this doesn't plot it anymore. So, and then, yeah, so that's again a pictorial of the things which we talked about. So what we are trying to discover, present, or enjoy. Are we trying to annotate something? So are we trying to record something, or are we trying to derive something? And so here is an example of derivation. So there are 2 sets of data points, which represents import and exports over time. But then we can subtract the 2 and figure out the trade balance. So that's a derived data. So a very simplistic one here, but it can be more complicated. Other set of action is, what we are trying to do is we are trying to, let's say, do some sort of search. And in search, what we are trying to do is, let's say, if we have a location known and the target known, then all we are doing is a lookup. When we know the location, but the target is not known, then we are performing an action called browse. But when we don't know the location, but we know the target, then we are trying to locate something. And when we don't know the location, and then we don't know the target, then we are trying to explore. So we can be in any of these, categories, and we may be trying to do any of these actions, depending on what we are trying to accomplish. And then we can have low-level actions, which are very specific about identifying something as outliers, comparing something, maybe you're trying, and maybe summarizing something at a high level on what we analyzed. So those are actions. We can have analysis, search, and query. Then we have targets. Whether we are looking at the entire data set, we are examining the trend of something, we are finding the outliers from the entire data set, or we're trying to pull out some features from the entire data set. We can look at, the attributes, whether we are looking at one or we are looking at many. We can examine the topology of the data set on, how things are connected with each other. And we can also examine the shape of something when we are working with shape data. So we have actions, and then we have targets. And then finally, how are we going to construct the visualization? How we are going to encode it, how we are going to interact with it or manipulate it, Do we need to create some faceting around it? Do we need to create some methods to kind of filter or reduce the information that is being shown? So that's the how part. So we have different methods available to kind of encode the information. We can either arrange something or we can map something. If we are going to arrange something, then we have few ways to kind of do that. We can just express a value of something and just simply plot it. We can separate out something by plotting it along, a 2D grid, for example. We can order things based on some properties, or we can align things again to an axis or something like that. If we have something like a geometry that is given to us, we can simply use it. We don't want to, sometimes we can't really change the shape of a map because that's what is given to us. We don't have the liberty to change a map or something because that will change the fundamental nature of it. Then we can map our attributes, whether they are categorical or ordered, ordinal attributes. We have different ways to kind of use the properties to kind of map these things. So if we have categorical attribute, we can use the hue to map it. If we have ordered attributes, we can use the saturation or luminance to map it. If we have, again, the ordinal attributes, we can use like size, angle, and curvature to map it. If we have categorical attributes, we can again use the shape to map it. And not very often used, but sometimes we can also use motion to map an ordered attribute. So that essentially provides us the ingredients to create a visualization from underlying data. Then we often want to have some interaction built into visualization. We can do interaction in a few different ways. One idea is to change something, and the change happens over time. So, when a user clicks on something, the screen changes. That's a change over time. There's also a selection. When you select something, you highlight it. So that is also a change that is happening through selection. And then we can have a navigation thing like we saw in the map. We are navigating by zooming in, and that navigation itself will change things and the information being displayed. We can facet something by creating a side-by-side view as a juxtaposition. We can break things out into partitions, or we can superimpose things as overlays, which is very often done with maps. Right? We can often also, we may have a need to filter something and say, don't show the data in this range or only show the data in this range. Sometimes you may want to aggregate the data and not look at the finest level of detail. The other time, you may want to embed only a portion of the data somewhere. So that's one way to reduce things. So if you look at the how part, we have ways to arrange the information or the data in some form or fashion. You also have an ability to map it based on whether they are categorical or ordinal attributes. We can map them by using different visual properties. We can also manipulate them by change, select, and navigation idioms. And then we can facet them with juxtaposition, partitioning, or superimposition. And lastly, we can have some sort of reduction going on with filtering, aggregation, and embedding. So that kind of provides us the building blocks or abstracted building blocks on kind of starting out with the journey of creating a representation of our data. Okay. So yeah, so those are the three things. So here, let's take an example here. Now here is the same data set represented in two different visual forms. On the left side, there is a tree showing different species. On the right side also, there's a same data set being represented with a tree juxtaposer kind of a view. They are both tree-like things, but they are representing the data in a very different way. In the left tree, you see that the data is encoded as a tree. On the left side, you have the vertebrates and invertebrates, and The vertebrates is broken down into further, species. And then the user has selected the mammal species. And so that's opened up further. The other ones are all closed. And then there is a little bit of a hint there. And so the shape of the triangle is showing that how much data is buried in this tree, how deep or wide this tree is. For example, the bird's tree is as wide as it is deep, but the fish tree is very deep and not as wide as the birds. And reptile tree is, even less than that. And so once you go to mammals, then you have marsupial and placental, and then you keep subdividing that, and we can see that, right? So this tree is kind of providing us information based on user interaction. You open up the tree and it keeps building up and provides us more information as we dig in. On the other hand, this one actually, on the right side, this one is actually showing all the information at the same time, but it allows you to select things. And when you select things, the things that are selected, they are kind of shown at a higher, they get more space, and the other ones are squished out. So you don't see the other elements as in that are legible, but you see some of the elements that are kind of selected elements are available in a kind of a stretched out space. So in this case, we have a tree, and the idea is to our task is to find something, right? Find a species of something. So we are trying to present something, then we are trying to locate something, and then we are trying to identify a particular type of species here. And the target is path between the two nodes. So we started out with vertebrates and went to mammals and then went to, placental and so forth. We are trying to track the topology of the path between the species on the left side with the tree notion. And actually with both, we are trying to do the same thing. In the space tree, we are encoding the information with, the tree idiom. And then we are navigating as we kind of click through, and then we are selecting things and filtering things, and then we get aggregated view of the tree represented on as we kind of dig in. On the contrary, like I explained earlier, tree juxtaposer, we kind of encode the information as the entire thing, and then we navigate and select things, and then based on our selection, the arrangement kind of happens, right? So both idioms are trying to do this, a similar set of tasks, but the encoding and the methods are different, right? So there's, chapters 2 and 4 provide kind of more information around abstraction. Okay, so let's see how we are doing on time. I think we are doing okay. Let's see. All right, so if there are any questions, feel free to post them on chat, and let's see if I can move on to the next one in the meantime. Okay, so let's move on. So let's talk about marks and channels. And so marks and channels are essentially the building blocks for creating visualization. Mark is nothing but the geometry to depict maybe an item or a link. And channel is a property that controls the appearance of that mark. Now the channel can be, in the language which we have been using, applies to an attribute, but the attribute is also called a dimension, variable, or feature, or a carrier. So all of those things mean the same thing. And then view is the property of the visualization, that how big a size or a resolution you have, what kind of projection we are using, and where we are looking at from. So what is the viewpoint? If we look at marks, we don't have a whole lot of marks. We have very few types of marks that are available to us. The simplest mark is a point mark, of course. Then we have another mark, which can be a line. And yet another mark can be an area, whether it's a triangle or a rectangle or a polygon, doesn't matter. Then we could also conceive of there could be a volumetric mark, but it's simply not possible right now with current set of display technologies, because all we see is 2D. We can fake it, but it's still 2D. So we have point lines and areas as our fundamental marks. Now the mark types can also represent, in addition to the item, it can represent a link, which shows a connection of something. But we can also use some sort of a containment to depict a link of sorts. So we can draw the lines to show the connection, but we can draw an area around some points to also show that these things are kind of related to each other. Now, properties or the channels which control the appearance of mark, we have quite a few there, and you'll see that these match the pre-attentive attributes which we talked about. So we have the position to represent a mark, or control the appearance of the mark. We have the shape, the size, color, and tilt. On position, we can use both horizontal and vertical position. Shape, obviously, we can choose different type of shapes. We can have different kind of size, either as length or area. On color, we can change the hue. We can change the orientation with the tilt. And then we can also have, in the size side, we can have the length, area, and volume. All three are possible, right? Now, when we look at channels, there are two types of channels. One of them is called the identity channel, and which provides information about what something is or where something is. And the shape, color, hue, and motion pattern tell us exactly that. They can tell us what something is or where something is. Or a position can tell us where something is, and shape, color, and hue can tell us what something is, or pattern is. Then we have another type of channel called magnitude channel, which tell us how much something is. How much is the size of something, the area of something, how bright something is, and those are magnitude channel. And the nice property of this thing is these exactly map to the way we kind of divided up our attributes. If you recall, we talked about categorical attributes. They should be used to map with the identity channel. And when we talked about ordered attributes, they should be mapped using magnitude channel. So that kind of provides us the mapping. So let's do a quick example here. So let's say if we have one category and one quantity, we have two variables. One is a categorical attribute, and the other one is a quantitative attribute. How can we represent that? What kind of mark will we use? Well, we can use a mark as a line, and then we can use the position as the X and Y channel for both a quantitative and categorical attribute. When you do that, you end up with a bar chart. If you have two quantities, you can use the mark as a point and again use position as the channel, and you end up with a scatter plot. When you have, again, two quantities and one category, you can still use point as the mark and position for both X and Y quantitative attributes, and use color for the categorical attribute. You still have a scatter plot, but now we have the dots that have colors based on categories. If you have three quantities and one category, you can still continue to use the point mark. And then in addition to color, we introduce size as the quantitative attribute. And then you still end up with a scatter plot, but now we have size and color also added to the scatter plot to encode that four quantities. Okay. And so, fine, we can now map things, but how do we measure that our mapping are indeed expressive, or they actually help us to see the data in some useful way? And so one idea here is definition of this expressive principle, that whatever method or encoding method that we employ should be able to express all and only data attributes. And this is what I was mentioning earlier, that if we have categorical data, we should use the identity channel to represent that data. If you have ordered data, then we can use the magnitude channel for that data. So that's the expressiveness principle. Same thing. Now, from the next thing which comes to mind is what makes these things effective. right? How do we know in which order we should use these things and which is going to be most effective? So the idea here is that we want to pick the attributes that are most important and match it with a channel that is highly noticeable or highly has a higher order of effectiveness in the order. And the other attributes we should relegate to less effective ones. Now the problem is, well, we need to know the order of effectiveness for all these channels that we have available for us. So who decides that? And how do we find that out? Well, we can use different measures to kind of find out the effectiveness of something, right? So you can use different ways to figure this out. So there is one measure, it could be accuracy. And if you look at Stephenson's psychophysical law, power law, it tries to kind of measure these kind of things. So if you measure intensity, depth, area, light, and some other things, and there's electric shock thrown in for good measure there, and you see that we are extremely good at measuring, in guessing the length of something. You see, there's almost a linear relationship from, if we think something is big, we can tell something is big. But if you look at saturation of color, for example, we will overestimate that something is more saturated when it's not really that saturated. And same thing with brightness, we will underestimate the brightness of the light based on what we see, even though its intensity may be very high. And similarly, the area and depth is also compressed. We will underestimate the area of a shape as the shape becomes bigger. And same thing with depth, we will underestimate it. We will underestimate how far something is. So length judgment is really very good. And so there was a famous study done by Cleveland and McGill, which actually put out a set of charts and compared, did user study for people to come and measure things, not measure things, but tell them how big or small they are, and they were able to kind of plot out the errors, and they kind of validated that the length was the easiest one. People could judge the positions fairly easily, followed by angles and circular areas who are kind of less accurate in judgment. Also, we need to look at something whether we can discriminate or see things explicitly or discretely as easily as possible. So here is a visualization which is showing the volume of telephone calls between different countries, and the thickness of the line depicts the volume of calls, right? So there are essentially three thicknesses. There's the thin, medium, and thick, right? So if you look at this line, the three thicknesses, we can more or less pull them out and discriminate and tell them that there are three thicknesses used in this plot. But if we have 10 thicknesses going on, we'd be very hard pressed to kind of pull those out and distinguish them with each other. And so we need to be careful on the kind of depiction that we use, that whether that's visually can be distinguished or not. So the thickness of line is not something that you can kind of have many variations on. You want to kind of minimize them to fewer level of thicknesses. And sometimes you can't really do that because you have a vast range. And if you still have to use thickness, then you have to consider binning the data into fewer bins so that you can use the channel that is available to you in an effective way. Now, all channels, while we have been talking about channels independently, but in reality, they are not necessarily that independent. So if you have position and hue, being shown here, right now they are fully separable, and that's fine. But when you have size and hue, you can start to see there is some interference between them. When you have width and height, the interference kind of increases. And then you have, kind of a different combination of intensity and color going on. You can start to see major interference going on. So all channels are not mutually independent, and that creates some complexity in picking out things. In this, we talked about the pre-attentive processing. So let's see if you can find the red dot in this box. You should be able to find this red dot pretty easily. This one also somewhat easily. This one will take a little bit longer than the previous one. This one would be even longer. Much more longer with this one. And with this one, it will take a longer time. So as we can see, once we start to introduce more channels, and more complexity is there, and it starts to kind of reduce the pop-out nature of something. It lessens, and it almost kind of goes away in the last one. It no longer pops out. Same thing with other attributes. Some of these things are we can make out something and pull out these popping out nature of things is easily apparent to us very quickly. For depth, size, and shape, proximity, we can kind of group things very closely to each other based on where they are. Our shadow doesn't show up very well on the slides. But if we look at parallel pair, they are not pre-attentive in nature, right? Because we need to go and look at each one of them serially to kind of judge them whether they are parallel or not. That's not pre-attentive. And once you kind of go into the serial mode, things are no longer pre-attentive. Things that are pre-attentive, they are available to us right off the bat. We don't have to think about it. They are just available to us. So again, with grouping, we can group things by containment, by drawing an area around set of points. We can group them by connection. We can see them by proximity. If things appear next to each other, they tend to form a group. We can also group things by similarity of hue, sometimes by motion, but motion is something that needs to be used very sparingly. Then I think we often judge things based on relative terms for the most part, but then you have to have a frame of reference to kind of judge something. So if I were to ask a question, which line is longer here between A and B, answer it, try to answer that, and the answer is B, right? Even though they are not really aligned, but we can tell which one is, sorry, I should say which one is shorter, the B line is shorter. But if we kind of frame them, but still they are not really aligned, we can still tell that B is shorter and E is longer. It makes it easier when things are framed. When we align them, it becomes even easier. Now, things may not necessarily always be aligned. For example, stacked bar chart. The things can happen anywhere, and you get unaligned frame of reference, and that makes it harder. And the aligned one obviously makes it much easy for us to kind of compare something. Same thing applies to luminance. And in here, look at the squares A and B. And one of them, the A square appears gray, and the B square appears kind of, light gray or almost whitish. And then there's a green cylinder there as well. But actually, they are the same hue. The problem is our visual system tricks us. And there is nothing we can do about that. Both A and B are same color, but they just appear less bright or more bright to us because based on the neighborhood where they are happening. So there's a shadow from the cylinder which is causing that illusion for us to occur. And that's kind of very well depicted in B and shown that that's indeed not true. Same thing if we have kind of a screen which kind of is an overlay of a cube, and if we say which one are the red cubes, well, we can tell them that those red cubes in the picture, we can find all of them. There are 4 of them on the top, right? So we can see, in fact, 5 of them. We can see that. But in fact, when we remove the overlay, they are totally different color. One of them is orange, the other one is purple. But just because we have added a screen of overlay, it shifts the hues, and that can cause some problems. So you have to be very careful when colors are being mutated by something coming on top of them. And if those colors carry some meaning, so you have to be really careful that meaning is not distorted or mixed up for something else. So here is a cheat sheet, and this is also available in the sticky notes zip file, and I suggest you download and keep it somewhere. And so this comes out of from a lot of research which has been done in this area. So we don't have to guess the effectiveness or expressiveness ranking of different channels that is available to us. We can use this as something that is provided to us. And we can see that position on a common scale for magnitude channels is really, really the most effective and expressive one, followed by position on unaligned scale, followed by length, followed by tilt, then area, depth, color luminance, and so forth. On the right side, we have identity channels. So we have spatial regions as the highly effective channel. Then we have color and hue. Then we have motion and shape. And we shouldn't be using motion that much anyway. So that's kind of something that needs to be used very sparingly because it has a tendency to overwhelm everything. So shape it is. So we don't have a whole lot of stuff to map categorical attributes, but we have quite a few things to map magnitude or order, magnitude or quantitative attributes or ordered attributes. So so this essentially gives us the tooling to kind of prepare our encoding and create visual representations based on how many of our dimensions we are working with. And we can start to pick and choose things in those order. And we want to pick and assign these channels in the order of importance of attributes. So we are going to pick the most important thing that we are working with and put that on a common position on a common scale if it's of a ordered nature, or we will use the spatial region if we can, if it's of a categorical nature, and so forth. So yeah, take a look at a couple of those reading materials if you're interested at a later time. All right, folks, so let's get started with the last part of this tutorial. Let's see if I can get set up here. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's talk a little bit about color. So if we look at our sensitivity to color, that's what it looks like. If you look at the visible spectrum, you see that we have a fantastic ability to kind of see green color around 555 nanometers, but our ability to see blue is not that great. Red is kind of in the middle segment somewhere there. So we are not very good at seeing all the colors in the entire visible spectrum. And so that has implications, right? So we got to be careful when using color because our visual system is not uniformly good at all the colors and wavelengths. So if we are looking at mapping categorical data, then we need to look at mapping using color map, which is categorical in nature. And so that's the concept of identity channel that we talked about. And the idea there is try to use segmented colors for using the categorical color maps. And it's also highly effective channel available for us after spatial position. And one thing to kind of consider there is when we are using color maps, we generally need to be careful that once we have too many categories, we don't run out of colors very easily that are distinguishable easily. So we kind of get limited to about a dozen colors, which includes, the canvas itself, the background, and all that. And so the idea is to choose fewer colors wherever possible, and then you may have to bin the data if you start to run out of colors or switch to another scheme where you can still kind of use more colors but not create confusion. So here is an example where, there are, so many variables available, and they are attempting to color it by using different sort of color schemes. And you see that this can become problematic very, very quickly. That, you can't really go about encoding the information in such form and expect that you'd be able to kind of decipher. Just because the computer can encode the information doesn't mean that we can decode it and make it useful. So for ordered color maps, again, we have to look at how can we encode the quantitative information in some sort of intuitive fashion. And one good way to kind of do that is to use grayscale to start with. Simply use a grayscale for sequential data, and or use a monotonic color map, which means just apply one color which goes from that color to white or that color to black, and just vary the intensity so that it can represent the data and the magnitude for the quantitative attribute. If you happen to be on a diverging data set where you have things kind of going from plus to minus, then you can use two hues and a neutral color in between to kind of go and create a divergent color map. Continuous color maps are tricky, but sometimes you have to use them. And the thing about many software packages are now deprecating the rainbow color map. And that's not really a good color map to use because it is perceptually nonlinear. And so either it needs to be transformed into something perceptually linear by equalizing the luminance, or simply not use it, right? But you can use it for categorical data, that's fine. But for continuous data, the rainbow color map should not be used. So here is one example of color map being used. It's a continuous color map, and it's just assigned to a 2D data, which goes from -3,500 to 2,000. And this is nothing but a topography or digital elevation model for for the southeast portion of US. And so if we change the color map and apply it in a different way, understanding that 0 is the mean sea level, and then we kind of assign the green to white kind of color region, which is supposed to be above sea, and then choose blue to dark blue hue to represent the ocean, then we can actually see the topography of the land much easier. So if you happen to know the domain, you can distinguish and segment the colors in a way that it kind of brings out those features much more easily than arbitrarily assigning a continuous color map without paying regard to the knowledge that you may have about the data. If you're looking at continuous color maps, you can look at this website called sciviscolor.org. They have done some work in kind of making them applicable for a variety of use cases. And so you can take a look there to get some. In designing color maps is incredibly hard, actually. It seems simple, but it's not. And other properties of colors, like we saw that, the channels are not independent with each other, so you have to be careful in choosing those channels to kind of encode the information. Similarly, the angle channel is not very accurate for us. Besides, few inclinations, like we can judge the horizontal, vertical, and 45 degrees pretty good, but things in between are not that great. Similarly, the curvature channel is not very accurate, and the shape and size can interfere with each other. And then motion channel is very strong and should not be used should be used very sparingly. Okay, so that was about color. Let's talk about tabular data. This is one of the most popular type of data that we come across. Okay. All right. So when we are looking at tabular data, how can we visualize tabular data? I think we have a couple of design choices. We can arrange, use the arrange method, or we can position, use the prime channel to kind of put our quantitative, ordinal, and categorical attributes using the position channel as well. If you look at the tabular data, we can consider them as a key value pair. And so key is an independent attribute and value is a dependent attribute. So the key attribute could be either categorical or ordinal, and the variable value attribute could be categorical, ordinal, or quantitative. So how do we go about encoding something? So let's say if we have two values, or ordinal or quantitative values with no key, we can employ the scatter plot idiom. If we have one key and one value, one categorical and one quantitative value, then we can use a bar chart. If we have two keys and one value, then we can use a heat map idiom. And if we have many keys and many values, then we can employ something which is called a set scatter plot matrix. So, scatter plots, it encodes two quantitative attributes using using the spatial channel, both in horizontal and vertical axes, and then the mark, which is the point, right? So here we have a scatter plot of the price of gold. And on the left side, it's using linear color scale, and on the right side, it's using kind of a log color scale. And it looks like that the gold likes to follow the log pricing quite well. It almost looks like a linear thing in a log price scale. So what are we trying to encode? We have two quantities. One is the carat, which is the essentially the size of or the purity of gold, and the price of gold. Both are quantitative and ordinal attributes. And then we are encoding them by expressing its value over the horizontal and vertical spatial position with a point mark type. And the idea here is, what kind of tasks does this sort of idiom can help us with? Well, scatter plots are good at allowing us to kind of find trends or outliers, or even see the distribution, see the correlations, and we can find clusters with them. So those are the tasks that are suitable for scatter plot. Now, if you're looking at how many points can we cram into a scatter plot, let's say we have a resolution of a screen as 1000 by 1000 pixels. Well, how many points can we insert in a scatter plot? You can potentially do hundreds of points, but once we get into the 1000 range, things can get very busy, because you can start to have overplotting, and you can start to have quite a bit of clumping somewhere, and you may not be able to see the data very well. Here is another example. It shows, the life expectancy for different countries here, which is depicted in red, sorry, colors. And you can see, see if there's a plot here. No, there's no animation. I thought there was an animation here. And so we can see how the different countries fare and based on this particular type of data. Another design choice we have is to kind of use the separate order on align regions with tabular data. So let's say if we have a data type which has animals and then their weight, and then we have one quantitative attribute and one categorical attribute. We can use the line mark and then express the value of attribute along both vertical and horizontal space or position. And the categorical attribute is shown on the horizontal scale, and the quantitative attribute is on the vertical scale, right? And the task for this sort of thing, and we get a bar chart, right? And so the task for this thing which is suitable is we can do kind of lookup, and then we can do compare. So in this case, the animals are listed on the left chart alphabetically. So we can do a quick lookup by saying, hey, we are looking at a wombat. You can alphabetically scan and then say, okay, the W appears towards the end, and find wombat there, and then look up its weight. However, while this is convenient ordering, this is not necessarily the thing that you may want to see or show. While it's easy for lookup, but maybe you want to order things based on ways to begin with. So instead of ordering things alphabetically and on the x-axis, you can actually order things based on the things that you are interested in. So if you're interested in showing the relationship of weight with animals, maybe one way to show that information would be to align them or order them based on the weight to begin with. So on the right side, then we can enable kind of an easier comparison of which animal weighs more versus which animal weighs less. Now, if you're looking at a bar chart, how many bars can we put into a screen which is 1000 by 1000 in resolution? Well, we can probably put maybe dozen to thousands of levels, but I think if we go more than hundreds of levels, more than 100 bars, then we have a hard time kind of distinguishing between them, right? So that's kind of the scale of bar charts. Another notion of this sort of thing is the stacked bar chart, where you have a multidimensional table. You have one quantitative attribute and two categorical attributes. So in this case, it's showing the distribution of population in just different states among different age brackets. So you have age brackets going from below 5 from 5 to 13, 14 to 17, and so forth, which is represented by different colors. And each state has a categorical key, which is shown in the horizontal axis. And the way the states are ordered is ordered by the size of population of each state. So it's already ordered, so we can compare them. Now, the encoding here is, again, the bar glyph, which is using both the line channel and then its segmented colors are being used to separate out the attributes. Now, stacked bar chart provides information on two things, right? It provides us information of finding out the part to a whole relationship, right? We can tell which population bracket is what proportion of that population in that state. But we can also do lookup, and we can also find some trends. If we are looking at scale, if you're looking at the x-axis, we can again do dozens to hundreds of levels. But then if you're looking at vertical scale, how many categories can we insert into a stacked bar chart? And again, if we put more than a dozen categories, we are going to have trouble with colors, because then we'll have to have colors which may not necessarily be able to be fully separable. And so you're kind of challenged there on the vertical side on how many subcategories you can show effectively on a stacked bar chart. Here is another notion, a variant of stacked bar chart called stream graph. And this employs kind of a layering of things. So it's showing the popularity of different artists over time. And there is a wiggle which is computed algorithmically, which gives this kind of organic sort of shape. And the ordering is also kind of computed algorithmically. So again, in this case, you have one quantitative value as the popularity, and then the other is also ordered key, which is in this case time, and then you have ordered another categorical attribute as artist. And then you derive algorithmically quantitative attribute for layering. So which artists are going to appear at what level or order, you kind of derive that algorithmically. Then you encode them as the height of the layer over time, and that's what you get a stream graph. This kind of has the same kind of task you can do like the stacked bar chart. You can do part-to-whole relationship, and you can do lookup values. You can find trends. And if we are looking at the scale, we can do hundreds of points in time. And we can do, on the shorter axis, the vertical axis, we can actually do a lot more from dozen to 100. And the notion here is it kind of keeps, since the artist popularity kind of waxes and wanes over time, we can keep using the same colors for different artists as long as we can label them. So you can see that, similar colors keeps getting used over time, but the artist names change. The stream graph is not particularly that effective. It's an option, but it's not that an effective chart. Similar to stream graphs, there is the stacked area chart, and now we have kind of in this case showing the popularity of browsers over time, and so we can see which browser has how much market share. And we can see those distinctions. So in this case, you have one quantitative attribute and two categorical attributes. One is the the percentage market share, and the other is the type of browser, and then the other one is time as well. And so the encoding here is just essentially a line with height component for the each category, and then you have the time component shown on the horizontal axis. This also, like the stacked bar chart, is good for showing the part-to-whole relationship. It's also useful for doing lookups, and it's also useful to find trends. If we are looking at the scale of this thing, we can have hundreds of points on the x-axis. But then if you are looking at vertical axis, we sort of get limited to that 1 dozen kind of thing, which essentially comes from the color side of things. Here we have an example again of a weight of cat over time, and so you have two attributes, quantitative attributes or ordered attributes. One is the weight, and the other one is the time. And if you can represent that with a dot chart by simply putting a dot for each value across horizontal and vertical position. But we can also connect them with a line and become a line chart and show that same information with the line chart. And if you're looking at the scale for the line chart or the dot chart, we are looking at hundreds of points essentially. And both of them can show us the trend. So that's the task which is sort of suitable for this sort of idiom. Now, here is something which can happen sometimes, and it shouldn't. And here we have a bar chart depicting the height of male and female, and also a bar chart which is depicting a height of 10-year-old and 12-year-old. And that's perfectly fine. You see, as on an average, you can see that the females or the males have more height compared to females. and the height of 10-year-old is less than height of 12-year-olds. Perfectly fine to use a bar chart for that. Sometimes people can make a mistake and use the wrong idiom. So at the lower right hand corner, you see a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. The height is depicted with a line chart. The 10-year-old height have less than 12, which is perfectly fine being depicted by a line chart. But it's wrong to depict the top right chart as a line chart where you have male and female heights represented with a line chart. And so one way to read this chart would be, as the female becomes a male, the height increases, right? And so this is the wrong idiom to use, and this mistake is not to be made, basically. That you should not use the line chart to depict categorical and quantitative plots with a line chart, but it's okay to use it for both quantitative attributes, which is the case with the height of 10-year-old and 12-year-old. So line charts, like I mentioned, should not be used for categorical attributes. Line charts also needs to be carefully managed on how you kind of create the aspect ratio of your chart, because that can create some distortions. And so let's talk about that a little bit. So here is an example of carbon dioxide measurements over time. And so on the horizontal axis, it's showing the dates, and on the vertical axis, it's showing, parts per million for carbon dioxide. And you see there are two lines going on, one in blue, one in red or pink. And the aspect ratio of this chart is almost like 1. And you can see that, every year the carbon dioxide kind of goes up and down, up and down. It kind of has a cyclic nature. And then we see this pink line, which is also showing this this sort of a curve or a regression line around the data. So in the top chart, you can see that the cyclic nature of the carbon dioxide measurements. But if you squish this chart to a different aspect ratio, which is shown in the bottom, at almost like 8 aspect ratio, where the vertical axis is just squished, you can see something very interesting there. That you can see that yes, there is a cyclic nature of carbon dioxide, but you can see that the cyclic nature is the trend is very different or much more easily visible. That there is a gradual rise of carbon dioxide every year, but there is a sharper fall. So the increase is gradual and the fall is much more precipitous. That you cannot see very easily in the top chart. And so depending on what you are trying to emphasize, that aspect ratio is very valuable to kind of show that trend much more clearly. And so there is a principle called banking to 45 degrees, and the software is supposed to compute the aspect ratio automatically for this sort of thing, but most softwares do not do that. Like Excel will not create a chart automatically and do the banking to 45 degrees. You have to carefully change the width and the height of the chart to make sure you get, more or less the right kind of aspect ratio to what you're trying to show. Here is a data set which has 2 categorical attributes. In this case, it's genes and condition, and one quantitative value which shows the activity of that gene. So you have 2 categorical attributes and then one quantitative attribute. And this makes kind of a good use case for kind of converting this to a heat map. And so in this case, you have cell by cell kind of a mapping of those attributes, and then the color is being used to show the activity of the genes on a 2D matrix. And in this case, it's an area chart that is being used. And the color map here is diverging. Things that are activated are kind of in green hues, and then things that are deactivated are in red hues. And this sort of idiom of heat map is useful to find clustering. It can also allow us to find outliers and can also summarize the information. If you're looking at scale, well, we can have 1,000,000 here, 1,000 by 1,000, rows and columns, and we can have, several hundred or hundreds of categorical attributes. But if you're looking at the color or the quantitative attributes, we are again getting limited by the color. So we should have maybe a dozen or less. If we have more than that, then we are not be able to distinguish the colors very easily. And sometimes this kind of chart, if there is an information around a hierarchy, you can also depict that with a dendrogram, which kind of shows the hierarchy of the clusters here. But that's highly dependent on the data you have here. So if there is a parent-child relationship among the cells or the rows or columns, you can depict that with a dendrogram. When we are working with higher dimensional data, then we run out of axes to kind of depict the data. So here we have scores of students' exams in different disciplines. And, one idea would be to kind of show them as a pairwise scatter plot matrix. So you have, the scores of math, physics, and dance on X and Y axes, and then you create a pairwise scatter plot to show them. Of course, half of them are redundant because they are doing inverse of that, but you can do that. So this is a SPLOM. And so, again, the idea here is it can help you in finding correlations, trends, and outliers. But when we are looking at scale, maybe we can look at maybe about a dozen attributes, but we can have hundreds of items in each of them. Yet another way to display the same data would be to use something called a parallel coordinate. In parallel coordinates, it's very similar to the XY plot, but instead of XY plot, it's like a YY plot. So for each dimension, you create a vertical axis. So we create an axis for math, physics, dance, and drama. Then we take the first row for the first student and plot it, 85. Then we go to the next discipline, which is physics. We go to the physics axis and find the point which is 95 and connect that with a line. Same, we continue that for dance and drama and, continue drawing that line for that student. So each student's line is drawn cell-wise and connecting different axes. And this basically creates a maze of lines. And so we can see those two rows highlighted in different colors, which compares the two student scores. And that can help us to kind of look at the higher dimensional data in this way as well. So let's see if we can get this example working. Okay, you guys can see the screen. Okay, this is a pretty interesting example. So here is an example of a parallel coordinate, which is showing nutrition of different type of foods. So let's say we are interested, and so each axis is showing the nutrient, and the amount of nutrient in any food type is depicted by, the scale for each axis, which varies. So for calcium, for instance, goes from 0 to 8, but calories go from 0 to almost 1,000, and, each axis has different scale. So let's say we are interested in foods that have high protein content. Actually, this got sorted out. So we can actually draw a window and say we are interested in foods that have high protein content. So we can interactively filter out things. Then we can say we want to kind of pick foods that have low sodium, so we can filter out that part too. And then that kind of gives you a nice filtering interface. So in this way, we can get a nice user interface with which we can filter out food. We can do the converse also. You can say, let's find out the proteins, food groups that have low protein content. And we want something which has low fat content too. And so we can filter out these things by creating these windows of and interactively kind of, filter these things out. There's also an ability to kind of, change the axes also, so we can kind of put the things together that we care about most next to each other. So this kind of provides a very interesting user interface and also a way to depict high dimensional data in a visual form. Okay. Let's go back here. So we have, sometimes we want to depict, the quantitative and categorical attribute, which we can depict with a bar chart. But we can also depict something like that with a pie chart. And so here we are seeing, this is essentially the clarity of diamond and the price of diamond in a pie chart. And so the idea here is to encode the information as an angle. And we are also using color to distinguish different categories of diamonds here. And the task here is to identify part to a whole relationship. And then if we can do about a dozen categories, because after that we'll run out of easily depicted or distinguishable colors. But it's also highly dependent on what the segmentation looks like. We can take the same idea but represent it as a polar chart. In this case, the encoding has to do with the length of the arc, not the angle of the arc. Everything gets the same angle, but the length of the arc is different. So things that have higher measure get a different length, and things with smaller measure get a smaller length, but the angle remains the same. We can also depict the same thing with, sorry, it was the count, not the price of diamonds. So it's a count of diamond in this case. So we can also represent the same information with a bar chart, but now with the bar chart, we lose the part to a whole relationship, which is evident with the pie chart. And somewhat evident in the polar chart, but not with the bar chart. We got to be careful on the type of data we are working with and choosing the appropriate representation for that. So on the top panel, we show kind of a rectilinear coordinate system, and we are showing different kinds of data in it. So if you have a linear data, going up and down, that's fine. Sinusoid, which goes up and down, that's kind of depicted in some of the cells. And then we have some other more kind of a sinusoidal, but more cyclic data being represented. If we take the same data and depict it in a polar or a polar coordinate system, we get very different kind of representation. So when we had a linear signal going on, and if we depict it in a polar area, we kind of get these spirals. When we start to look at cyclic data, we start to get this cyclic pattern. So sometimes it's meaningful to kind of, if you happen to work with cyclic data, you can consider polar coordinate system for plotting it instead of rectilinear one to show those cycles better. So we looked at tables in different ways of kind of employing the design space and kind of representing those things in a visual form. So we can obviously express the value as a dot chart or a scatter plot. We can separate, order, and align using the bar charts and the stacked bar charts. We can use different axes, axis orientation. We can do XY plots. We can do parallel plots. We can do polar charts as radial, and you can also do kind of a heat map sort of thing. And sometimes you can also create these space filling charts called tree maps as well. You can take a look at this chapter in the book as well, and some other reading material. let's see. So that brings us to the final lecture. Let's see if there are. Feel free to put any questions you may have. And so let's move on to the final one. And can you see the screen? Fine.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's kind of conclude with kind of a general set of guidelines for visualization. When you have to create multiple representations for something, you need to be very careful on, we are dealing with human attention, which is very finite and not that long. And, our ability to pay attention to something is limited, right? So we need to prioritize vision over memory because memory is such a scarce resource. When we have an ability to create an animation or a side-by-side view, both comes with a pro and con. If you create an animation, well, we lose it when the next frame plays. When you create a side-by-side view, and then we have less space to cram things in. So if you're creating an animation, you should have kind of a frame control where you can kind of go back and forth to kind of see things. But obviously, a side-by-side view is another way to kind of accomplish that when possible. And there can also be an issue with, when things change, you don't tend to remember what has changed. So there is something called change blindness. And I'll put a link to a YouTube video, which you guys can take a look at it later on change blindness. We covered that, we know that we can create visualization from fundamental items or channels, and those are in two different categories. One is the identity channel, which is suitable for mapping our categorical attributes. And then the magnitude channels are suitable for mapping the order attributes. And there is an effectiveness order that is available to us. And so we can employ these things in that order based on what we are working with. So this essentially provides us a nice cheat sheet to kind of pick the channels based on effectiveness. Color we talked about, and the idea there is use as little color as possible for any visualization, because color will interact with pretty much anything, and it will become difficult as more and more things are going to use colors and more colors are used. Try to use intensity and luminance as the primary channel, because our eyes are really good at identifying intensity. If you have a chance of interpolating the colors, interpolate them in HSV space, not in RGB space, because that's more closer to our visual perception. And more importantly, try not to create your own color map. Look at a resource like colorbrewer2.org, and they have pre-baked color maps, and I'll open this up a little bit later and you can see what they do there. And you can pick out the color maps from there. And I also pointed out to another resource called sciviscolor.org, where you can pick out continuous color maps from. So try not to define your own color maps because it's incredibly difficult to get those right. Minimize spatial dimensions where we can. So if you can get away with using 2D, just use 2D. 3D is a very hard place to be, because it imposes severe restrictions on, how far you can see. There can be a lot of occlusion that can be there. There can be perspective distortion. 3D is great fit for where shape understanding is very important. So depicting, let's say, a graph or a tree, abstracted tree in 3D is not really that good idea. But depicting a shape of something where shape understanding is important is that is a great fit for 3D. So here is an example of we are trying to depict something in 3D, but we can only see the front side of it. We can't really see the depth, right? So you can have a lot of artifacts in 3D. Here is an example of distortion. So this is a picture on the airport in Chicago. There's a tunnel, and we can see that the walkway is just the same width, but it appears to converge at horizon. And this notion of convergence, where the parallel lines converge, is called the perspective projection. This is something which is innate to us. We see this in our, this is built into our visual system. We see things in perspective projection. And so here is a example of that. So here are two cubes represented in different projections. On the left side, we have orthographic projection. On the right side, we have perspective projection. And the difference between two is the distortion, essentially. You see that the two cells marked with the yellow line in 1 and 2, they are the same in orthographic projection. The size is the same, but in perspective projection, they are not the same. So 2, the square towards the front of it is much more bigger than the one which is at the far side. And the other property of perspective projection is in perspective projection, the parallel lines will converge somewhere, but in orthographic projection, the parallel lines remain parallel. So those are the two differences. There is no distortion in orthographic projection, and it's kind of unnatural. That's not what we see in with our real eyes or with our vision system. But in perspective projection, the parallel lines converge and there is distortion. And so with software, it's pretty easy to kind of go one way or the other. You just click a button and then you go into orthographic mode, and then the other you can change it to perspective. And I think this is only relevant in 3D space, not in 2D, because in 2D it doesn't really matter. When you're creating visualization, always include legends on what it's supposed to mean. Provide tooltips if it's interactive visualization, and provide annotations. It's really important to mark those things out. And I think one more thing I want to say about annotation. Oftentimes you'll hear people say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, not really. I think that's kind of a misnomer. 1,000 words, whose 1,000 words, right? I mean, your 1,000 words would be different than mine, and somebody else's would be different than somebody else. It doesn't make sense. When we are talking about visualization, when we say those 1,000 words, well, 1,000 words or 100 words, whatever it is, they better be written, because there's an interpretation associated with visualization. That interpretation should be better marked in words in an as clear way as possible. It shouldn't be left for interpretation. And so oftentimes you go to a museum or an art museum and look at a picture. I mean, what are you going to make about that picture? They are beautiful, they represent something, but everybody's interpretation is going to be very different, which is great for art, but not really a good thing for visualization. Imagine you are kind of showing some scientific information and everybody starts to interpret it as they feel like. Well, it's not open to interpretation. You have to provide the context and the information on what the picture is supposed to represent, so that you avoid that ambiguity that a visual medium brings with it. Also, a bunch of things here. When you have an opportunity to create something at higher resolution, you should do that and choose that over immersion. I think VR is making a comeback with new devices and things like that. That was also the case in 90s and things like that, and people were making different gadgets and things like that. And in 10 years, they found out that, making things immersive just for the heck of it doesn't really make them effective. And so things kind of, petered out in early 2000s. So immersion definitely has a use and has a value, but it's been found to be limiting in many ways. And so again, with this go around, we'll again find out if that value proposition of immersion is really better, or it's only suitable for certain kind of subset of tasks where we see high value for that. So certainly look at, prioritize resolution over immersion. When you're creating visualization, there is this a concept proposed by Ben Schneiderman, and sometimes, in some ways people call it Ben Schneiderman's principle, and he says provide an overview first and provide details on the map. And this is again the notion of map, which we covered. You look at the map of the globe or a country at a high level, but as you zoom in, more details are available, as you zoom in. So there's this notion of semantic zooming, which provides more detailed information based on the context and the level you have zoomed in is made available to the user. And responsiveness has to do with interactivity and availability of resources on how can you provide visual feedback when you interact with something. When you select an item, it should probably change some color so you know what you have selected. Also, there is a notion of, when you are talking about visualization, there is a tendency to bring in aesthetics and design and other things into the mix, and obviously they are there. It would be wrong to say they are not there, but the idea for visualization is about the purpose and the objective, and the function should be kept as the prime and not the form. So sometimes people can contrive and create visualization which look funky and nice and aesthetically pleasing, but that's and sometimes you can get away with it, but most often than not, you should avoid that tendency to kind of prioritize aesthetics and just to kind of change the shape of something to make it look visually pleasing, but rather than let the data drive the form. And I think when you're working with lots of data, you need an ability to read and write data in a parallel format. And there are lots of libraries that have been developed to write the data in a parallel friendly format. So use those instead of trying to invent your own format. Again, data, when it becomes large, it's very hard to kind of move the data from disk to memory. So try to visualize the data when it's in memory or as close to the data as possible, because data, the latency can be very high. Sometimes it can take a very long time to load the data and create the data in a form or shape that is amenable for analysis. And more importantly, when you have visualizations, I was mentioning this earlier, that include the legends, include the captions, and they're extremely important because in long run, pictures tend to survive for a very long time, and if their context goes missing, they are very easily misinterpreted. So make sure that you write good captions for your visualizations wherever possible. I mean, oftentimes in presentations we don't include captions, but if we are going to distribute them, then it's good to include them somewhere so that the reader can interpret them as you intended them to be interpreted. Okay, so take a look at chapter 6 in the textbook, which I pointed out, and that kind of concludes this set of lectures. And if you happen to get a grab of this book, I really recommend reading the abstractions chapter at least once more, but the marks and channels chapter should be read several times. I think it provides such an important and foundational information on constructing these visualizations that you'd gain a lot out of it by remembering these principles and how to employ the idea of breaking up your data into different type of attributes as ordinal or categorical, and then employing either the identity or the magnitude channel to express that information in a visual form, and use the encoding that was shown, that people have worked out on what's very effective for the ordered attributes and what's very effective for the categorical attributes.